My name is Bernard Sweeney. I'm an Irish traveller and based here in Sligo, and this is a kind of a quick introductory type video conversation with my good friend here, Dilean Foley, who's an archaeologist, which is an awful terribly long word, and I used to have to ask him what did that mean. He told me he was an historian, history. I said, okay, you are a historian. But it took me a while to get used to these words. I don't be using them to try to impress upon anyone. We're going to talk about the topic of racism, and this is somewhat dedicated, I guess, to Mayo against racism, but it's really against everyone should be against racism. If I was to say racism wasn't real, but yet we know the effects of racism are very real. We know that the institutionalization, segregation, but yet at the same time, there's something fundamentally sticking out of all of this that we feel could be actually fundamentally important to this. And that's the history of Irish travellers, it's the history of Ireland, its pre-colonisation, its colonisation process, and the various centuries and decades that followed that have led Irish travellers today, several centuries later, in a situation where it is well not to have changed. We see this in the treatments, the systems, the acts, the laws. We see it in the public domain, the political domain, the media domain, and it's a kind of a non-stop micro-psychological attack. It's a psychological genocide of a people. Brief history of Irish travellers are still trying to figure out who we are, what we are. We're recognised as an ethnic minority in the eyes of the settled population after a very long campaign till 2017, where forcibly by EU laws and pressures and campaigners give us a symbolical gesture to suggest, yes, they are a ethnic minority, indigenous people. Sorry, remove indigenous. Ethnic minority was the recognition, symbolical. In other words, symbolical meant no financial, no other structural, no system changes. People remain the same. Remaining the same for us wasn't going to cut it. We have a very life short expectancy of 65 years old. 50 odd plus % of travellers do not make it the age of 40. 11% made up of our community deaths is by suicide. And I mentioned about the acts and the laws. So when we say that racism isn't real or racism is real, we fit the criteria of a community that has been institutionalized and systematically been victims of racism for a very long time. And our deep, deep history with something that Dilean Foley knows quite a bit about. You go back as far as you like, over the centuries, there's always been degrading, dehumanizing references made about Irish people. Now, if you're thinking for 1 second that two white people are talking about racism and sure everybody should listen, that's not the case. We're not trying to win a competition to stake a claim to be the victims of racism. It's not fun. It kills people. It destroys economies. It destroys cultures, identities, and communities. There's no competition. We're saying, what if it's not racism? What if it is that we are experiencing racism, but other people can't see it because they don't see racism as white people against white people? What if the white people can't see it because they've got reserves in their memory banks that racism must be for against black people? And this is where travellers are being completely left out of not just decades, but centuries of dialogue and debate. We've also seen in very recent times where the government are setting up stalls. They're coming out talking about how important history is, how important it is to understand the complex and the deeper, darker parts of history, but never once have given mention to Irish travellers. Now, again, why would Irish travelling be any more important than any other section of Irish society? The Irish speakers, the West of Ireland, working classes, as they call them, townspeople, all these people are getting suppressed. All these people are being deprived and excluded from their own knowledge-based memory banks, such as their own history and ways of being. The reason why all this is important, because Irish travellers are getting persecuted for being Irish people. They may call us travellers, but they're also called us thinkers. They call us itinerants, bogs people, woods people, hedge people, and you name it, going back through the decades and centuries. But the same people, same culture. A divergence that happened 360 years ago was a divergence caused, again, Dilean might fill in, Elizabethan conquest. All of this I'm rambling out, and you might try to get your head around it. I'll even break it down to the biology and the properties of language, the construct of language, a linguistic monster we call the English language, which is nothing against the English people. This is no anti-English, anti-Protestant, anti-anyone. This is a conversation taking a step outside of that particular mentality that went global and has been for centuries, that has influenced through foreign policy, to domestic policies, and various institutions, systems, and economies. It has impacted upon. Within that channel, within that mentality, within that frequency, has come a lot of isms, from fascism to racism and so on and so forth. In that linguistic language, it was in that particular tone that it was legalized, that they had scientists, doctors to make racism real. Now, if you go to any scientist, not any scientist, I should throw this one over for DNA. If the belief is that we all came from Africa, or is there a belief that we all have one historical mother? And if we do, that means we're all genetically connected. So what makes us different? Is it the genetic markers? Is it because some people got blue eyes, brown eyes, skin complexion, environment? All of these things are being used in this particular mentality as weapons and have been for a very, very long time. Sorry for the rant, and now I'm going to hand it over to Trevor. We're going to briefly talk about what we're doing. Dylan's going to tell you a bit about himself, quickly, briefly. Sorry, Dylan, I shouldn't have said that. Take as much time as you want. But I think you want 7 or 8, 10, 20 minutes. But yeah, we're going to dive into the real hardcore stuff of racism.
Okay, well, that's a good introduction. Yeah, so Megan, so I suppose where would archaeology come into it? You were saying about the word archaeology. What does it? It means archaea means.
Well, people, yeah, I say if people say travelers or anyone wants a quick idea of what an archaeology is or what they do, you've got two options really. You've got Angelina Jolie or you got Harrison Ford.
Well, all of that is true, obviously. Okay, yeah. So
are you real archaeologists?
kind of. If you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, you'll find that his enemy. There's two types. He says there's two types. Indiana says, you know, the enemy, isn't it? Belloc. He says you're nearer to me than you think, Jones. You know, I've turned to the dark side because he sides with the Nazis to get the artifact. There's always that tendency, yeah. But archaeology, the word actually means study of. It means to study logy. It means this Greek word. It means the study of first things. So like anything that's the beginning of something, if you know what I mean. So in a way, what you've described is a good description of why would I be involved, or why would an archaeologist or a historian be involved in those kind of things. Really, it's because when we're talking about things like racism and that, a lot of very complicated subjects like that can go around in circles unless we kind of have some understanding of how it got to be the way it is. And the only way we can understand that is by tracking back into the past to try and find out, can we find a beginning? Now, obviously, everything goes off infinitely into the past, but we can usually find a point in time where it makes where modern events that we're interested in began. You know, so like modern form of racism we know emerged with the emergence of colonialism, essentially modern colonialism in the.
Just give people an idea. Why the hell would history be any bit important, particularly when we're talking about things that happened 5 years ago, 500 years ago, 1500 years ago? Why would this matter?
Sometimes it's
a good starting point, if you don't mind, is that 1 week, as you mentioned to me before, which is a very good example, that if you take it in strings, in other words, if you start here and work your way back instead of trying to go into the history and work your way forward. So at the present moment, we can all acknowledge that we're inside a English language. We're sharing an English language. So that would be the beginning of something, wouldn't it? Because it's not originally our language.
Yeah, so it had to come here at some point. Yeah, exactly. So we could trace that, we could follow that back into the past, you know, and we would find a point where it first arrived into Ireland. And that would probably be with soldiers with the Normans, for example, or, you know, Saxon slaves that some probably captured or whatever. But yeah, you could trace the English language landing into Ireland and its development in the cities of Dublin and follow it through time and how it becomes eventually Actually,
How
not.
do it, and I'm going to ask you some of these questions, but I think could be important, if you don't mind, my friend.
Work away, work away.
Okay, so the English language came to Ireland. We'll say it really kind of kicked up a few notches during the 1600s through imperialism, the institutions and the colleges. But even prior to that, there were ideas behind how do we introduce the language, or how do we get the Irish people to get rid of their language? Was it? There was a kind of a blunt replacing one with the other kind of tactic, wasn't it?
So Ireland was invaded. Ireland was invaded many times. Ireland was invaded eventually by Normans and English people, English-speaking people, and they lived in the towns essentially. Our culture was a bit different. Our culture didn't involve towns in that way, walled towns and things. They were a continental and thing, you know.
Was there much differences then between the English and the Irish?
Hmm?
Was there much cultural differences or way of thinking?
Large cultural differences, maybe not as huge as people make out, but pretty big. I mean, like really very different thought, very different culture, history, very completely different history. Completely different societies, probably in reverse to each other, if you know what I mean, in terms of how they saw the world, if you know what I mean. Ireland was a very different place. It was if England was full of towns and shops, if you know what I mean, Ireland would have been the opposite. It hadn't really towns in that nature. England ran on money merchant system. Ireland ran without money, if you know what I mean.
And so just on that, because again, you know, and you get this, you've seen it a million times when we talk about history, and people say, "Oh Jesus," we're trying to bring it back into the Dark Ages. As if we had some kind of time machine, we're going to bring people back. This is the thing that I think a lot of settled people I've noticed in all my life growing up trying to understand this. There seems to be a huge blind spot when we talk about history. You would have a lot of a great grasp it because you have a few different advantages, layers. One, you're in the west coast of Ireland. Then you come from a particular place called Sligo, like myself, living there. So that has a special kind of feature in history itself. So the mentality itself gives you a kind of an outside perspective of even your own community, we'd say, hypothetically. So, yeah, I suppose the point that we're making is that it is strictly mentality based. There's two languages. The Irish are afraid to look back because they've been told by the dominant language in our heads not to look back there, not to go back there. There's nothing back there. Dark misery. Now, the culture itself is thousands of years old. It comes from the land they call the land of the saints and the scholars. That means educated, intelligent, sophisticated people once lived here.
That's right, yeah. So we would say that like things like when we're dealing with things like like you said earlier, how is it connected in that way? But if we go back far enough in Irish history, we can understand that, for example, the British Empire would have started in Ireland, put it simply.
Developed was a kind of thing.
Yeah, even before it was an empire, the first place that they would.
Ireland was the first overseas country to be colonized, wasn't it?
It's the first overseas country that was colonized by English people, and it began in the 12th century, but it was really only started off in the 16th. So that's the details don't matter too much, except that the important thing is to understand that the whole thought process of empire, most of it was created in Ireland first, and it's because of that things that we later call racism, which we know later on is applied to like African people in the West Indies and African slaves who were brought over from Africa or sold as slaves into the West Indies. The racism then that's brought into South Africa and into India, and in those colonies, it's based on color, essentially, and religion. But we know that before that, religion was the big.
This was your excuse.
Yes, it's an excuse. Always, it's an excuse because really, what colonialism is doing, you know, to be an empire, you have to divide people apart, and if you can rule them, and you can take the money, take the resources, and you can become rich, and that's great. And you base the whole concept on the fact that your civilization is superior.
If I was giving you, throw it in the span of the work, say what you're talking about there in the English colonization, that was the ideas, that was the plans. If we were to bring it forward again, wouldn't we see the same situation in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand? When we see the after effects of that, even bring it closer to home. Look at Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants, the North and the South.
Yeah, so Ireland shows lots of
psychological divides, are they not?
Yes, so the divides, Ireland itself is still divided, and that's a typical thing of it's a sign that the place was once colonized. The fact that those things are put in there and that they're made into conflict. You'll see the other places.
If you go to any other country, you see people with all respects, almost identical, although we would look identical to somebody from the far side of the world, because we've got skin play. So if we went to any country where there was people almost identical, killing each other and calling each other names and subhuman, you could say, oh, I see, colonization was here.
You would have a good bet that it was, yeah. So you'll see it in Africa. The biggest examples in the world, of course, are Israel, Palestine, which is an ongoing one, and also the British Empire that left that one behind. There was another one in which I think millions died when they were separated at the time that they were withdrawn in India, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. That was a huge division, if you know what I mean, and that's another one.
Yeah.
And you see it also. You see the other thing. You see the two things. You see sometimes divided, but also like countries made that bear no relation to the people on the ground. So they just draw lines on maps, for example, in the Middle East.
We're talking about mentalities, right? And this colonial mentality. This colonial mentality came to Ireland, and I'm basing this a lot of utopia anyway. Well, some of that, I could get some of it wrong. But basically came to Ireland. They didn't see any houses, so they took to people's lands. They seen institutions to educate people, made it illegal for people to practice their laws or traditions. Does that sound familiar, what happened in Ireland that happened to India and other parts of the world?
The same process, particularly in America and places like that, where people had lived a different type of life, if you know what I mean, and therefore it was easier. Like if their houses weren't made of stone, it was easier. I know we did have castles made of stone, and we had churches made of stone, so we weren't nomadic entirely like what people like to make out. But our society was more mobile and based on cattle, and horses. And
Well, look, at our culture has been one of, I wouldn't say nomadism either, because we had farms, castles also. We also had traders, we also had wagons. We had houses with wheels on them, and the English had houses were stuck in the ground and had no flushing toilet. So
there was just a difference. It doesn't matter. I mean, you could be the greatest king, the richest person in the world or whatever, but you might not, but your culture would mean that, for example, the Turks were some of the biggest empires on the planet, but they still, because of their traditions, they lived in big tents with big fancy cushions and wall hangings and, you know, all of this kind of thing. It was just and gold, whatever, but it was all luxurious, but it wasn't built. It was built out of felt and linen, and it was
interesting because a lot of people even say what the outside world might call the ghetto perspective or view, right? Even in camps, and we got some bad camps. We're living under power lines and dumps. Used to share the same gate with a dump. So this is the environment where we're living. But despite the fact that they had house trapped in these situations, like they do with a lot of people, when I say they, I mean a systematic old colonial mentality that's still in operation, not people per se. When they had these ill hostile environments, they still thought in some way that we'd surrender and submit and be part of the system. Yet they couldn't see that our culture was far more beyond the physical aspects. In other words, it was the human connection and the culture that flows through that. The reason I'm saying this is because when I say travellers and in the west of Ireland, Irish settled, we go that far, we really want to push it. Versus settled Irish, two different split mentalities. That's okay. It's about overcoming these things. So the same racism we would have experienced, and we call it racism now because we know it was an engineered piece of work that became legalized as well.
It was conscious. Sorry.
Well, it wasn't for the savages in America. It was the uneducated savages in Australia. It was the savages always somewhere else that needed this education. Was it not almost identical to what they said about the Irish people?
Yeah, so
because
Ireland was the first colony and the very first kind of forts when the frontier was moving westward, the whole idea of the civilization is on the one side, is on the English side of the frontier, and beyond that is savagery, savages, and they'd make maps that would say that. And you see it in Wild West movies, for example. It's the same idea. The Indians are all wild and we're civilized here in our settled, and we're making little towns, little settler towns. And so the same process first happened in Ireland, where they pushed the boundary westward, and they took, as they took the land, it was much easier to justify that if the people were told, they were telling their own people that they're savages, there's no point in worrying about them, they don't own the land anyway properly, and we're doing them a favor. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're right, God. There's something interesting you said, because if it started in Ireland, and it had developed in Ireland, right, over a very long process of time. And if people are trying to still work out and figure out what is the hell is what the two white people talking about, what we would be saying, and I would be saying as a traveler going up, is that We are slightly outside that. Ireland was also outside of Europe. It had a kind of opposite type of culture, mentality, language, tradition, way of life. It was attacked, it was changed. So what are we talking about? We're talking about something that didn't change. And that thing, I believe it didn't change, happened in 1922 when nothing changed. When Ireland decided to keep all the legal systems, the educational systems, the land rights systems, the institutions, and just about everything that was colonial English, Dublin maintained and kept in 1922, which might explain why there's a settled people and why there's a travellers. Why are the travellers getting systematically tortured, I would say, given our health situation? So all this happened. So people are wondering from the outside, why are we still talking about this? We're saying that if it hadn't stopped, that if the colonial mentality hadn't stopped, based on Ireland, where it first developed, why not bring it back to Ireland, examine its history, its imperial experience. And again, it's not about better or worse. The history is like waves, there's ups and downs, and everyone has the goods and the bad and the in-betweens. But there's something fundamentally important, I believe here, psychologically, to overcome this thing we call racism. If maybe we start here in Ireland, would you agree?
I think so, yeah, because Ireland shows you that it's not that color initially wasn't the important thing, as it were. People could be equally discriminated against. Color was a convenience thing to divide people with, but it could also be religion, or it could be tribe, or it could in India they would castes. They would say, well, you're from a better caste than these people. These people can be civil servants. You're soldiers. You're better than them, or you're worse than them, or whatever. And they would use it, whatever people believed or whatever was going on, they would use it against people. So when the empire, because the empire started in Ireland, this is the British Empire now, not the first empire in the world by any means, but because this particular empire that we have to deal with now, if you know what I mean, started in Ireland, there was no people of different colors, so that never occurred to them. But they found other ways to divide people, and the way that they would divide people was, well, the people within the Pale boundary, within Dublin, for example, as to start with, within their colony, they're civilized, and people who live in towns, they're civilized, but people who live in the country, they're not civilized. And people, and then over time, when religion changed and stuff, it became, well, these Protestants, they're civilized, and those people who live in the country and are Catholic, they're not civilized, if you know what I mean. But yeah, you'll see in Ireland that those divisions still exist. For example, between town and country, it's still a big thing in Ireland. But that's because it was ingrained initially. It was literally a division, not between town and country Irish people, but it was between the English colony and the Irish countryside. And so the idea was that as the colony expanded into the countryside, the idea was they were pushing aside a people that they would exaggerate. Well, they're savages, they're different to you, they don't believe in God in the same way. They're pagans, and we're doing them a favor if we go in and take the land and build things. And that excuse then gets moved over to the West Indies and to America. And over there, it becomes about, like, it's Indians they're looking down on, and the same process starts. Or it's when slaves are brought in, and the same idea again. Now, the idea there again is that this time it's easy to divide people by saying, well, these people are white, and these people are a different color, these people are darker, these people are black. And therefore, that's what makes you different. You white people, you're better than them people. And
well, it's also just worth mentioning, and we do, and we're mindful. Psychologically, I used a French philosopher, Fontaine. I can't even pronounce her names because I don't even talk to a lot of people. I don't engage with intellectuals. But I think that's his name. He was a psychiatrist or a philosopher, and so on and so forth. He was talking about the colonial mentality. We have the same situation here in Ireland. We believe that mentality is carried over and maintained. Now, what I think is important is worth mentioning. When we talk about a mentality, in the same way when the English came here and invaded, we had the same skin complexion. We weren't shocked by their appearances. And actually, we probably had better armies and better militaries than they had for centuries till the war was down. So when you reverse that to the West Indies and other parts of the world, you might find, again, these people had ancient cultures, civilizations, scientists, doctors, you name it, thousands of years, very, very similar to the old Irish culture. Actually, the dress code and the traditions and the honor base with Japan were also very similar. So with this mentality, it was more of a psychological and physical at many parts. It was to Africans, it was to people from India and other parts of the world. So I think that's worth mentioning because we already know this.
Okay, so what I would say to you is that one other thing, very important thing, that exactly what we're talking about here that summarizes it really is that another step in empire, if you want to rule other people, and to make that much easier and much more efficient to do, what you need to do is cut them off from their history as well. You don't just divide people. You also cut those people you divide from their history so that you tell them what their story is. If you can do that, then you can tell them anything you want. You can say, well, those people are better than you, or you're worse than those, or we're better than you, and that's why we're in charge. You're from an inferior civilization. All this.
If we were to give an example of that, I'd be happy to give one. If we look again in the last 100 years, mind the 500 years, the last 100 years since 1922, the independence of the state, the new settled Irish, they wouldn't call themselves settled Irish, they were calling themselves the Irish, the default Irish, and that's what they believed. For the last 100 years, we would say that the settled people have lost, not, they like to think they have an evolving, evolutionary type culture going on. But that isn't the case because evolution has serious side effects if you go in the wrong direction. That only means you're adapting to a new place, time, and environment. But we would say that the settled community in the last 100 years have almost been psychologically erased from their roots, their languages, their cultures. It's getting further and further beyond their own reach, and they know this. So we know that we didn't come from that world. We didn't come from that culture. We didn't come from that mentality. And ours goes back equally as long and far as any other, but keeping in that psychological corridor, almost like a parallel to this new developing, emerging mentality. A very indoctrinating, systematic way of doing things. If you look at the Irish education systems, you'll see they're still by the English, from the foundation upwards, still English. You see their institutions, and you see that even the education is a tunnel into industrialization. In other words, it's still one system. So all the institutions would have a lot of time excluding travelers, othering us. Who are ye? Where did you come from? Despite the fact we had castles and all, we got all the proud names, the musicians, we still got the warriors who are world champions in various different sports. We got the singers and we got the whole lot. We got everything we once had, but not knowing what happened, how things got here, but we too were impoverished from our knowledge. To settle in Ireland, unfortunately, even in the Trinity College, even in the Maynooth College, the Queen's College, no fault of their own. They took up programs and institutions that helped themselves blind spot themselves to their own history and their own people. That's Ireland 2021, where travellers are still living under segregated systems, apartheid systems. That's quite remarkable in this day and age, isn't it?
It is remarkable, and it's a fact, yeah. But that's exactly what we're working on, isn't it? Because that's why we think it's necessary, and you could see it today in the celebrations of the history were being made today, and but there was no mention.
No mention of travelers.
Yeah.
The other thing, why Dilean does this, and we do this, and we keep doing this, is that it's important, I think, for a lot of different reasons. One, it's not travelers over settled. It's not even travelers versus settled, because the vast majority of settled people are decent, good people. And they just don't understand the traveler situation because we've both become psychologically divided almost into the others. We don't want to be part of a system that can treat us that way. They can't understand why we don't become part of that system and be like them. We're saying you don't even like yourselves in the first place. Yeah. So we've got a lot of issues going on.
Sorry, go on.
Our role, really, our situation, one, I come from the traveller community. Dilean comes from the west of Ireland. We have a vested interest. It isn't about traveller settlement. It isn't about black and white. It isn't about ethnicity, religion, cultures, identities, or anything else. It's about taking a step outside this particular colonial mentality, this particular colonial language. And if we can examine it without all the labels, still knowing what we know, but without having to think about them, I think we make brilliant progress, and that's what we're doing with Rural Aid. That's what we're doing thanks to people like Liz Hayes, Thomas I can, that God is on this path of creating documentaries, platforms, and engaging with all groups. Because if you are rare, whatever skin complexion you are, you look out through your eyes. You don't necessarily take heed of your skin complexion. I don't take heed of my head of hair the same way. It's a subconscious thing. We go about our business. So I'm going to finish up and then I'm going to give over to Dylan for a couple of minutes. I just want to say that our part, we believe it's important, right? Because I grew up around misery, death, pain, suicides, lost a lot of family members. And that's not just me or about, that's every traveller in Ireland. It doesn't mean that the settled people didn't get it tough, didn't get it bad. We've seen the mother and baby homes. We've seen the other forms of exclusion, the Irish language. It means that travellers are getting persecuted for being human beings in an Ireland of a culture that once was the dominant majority culture. And it's not about reversing systems or breaking systems or overhauling systems. It's about coming out of the systems, tweaking them, changing them, and maybe we can cause a positive effect globally because there's no inferiors outside that colonial system.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I see your cat. He's on top of your shoulder.
Huh?
It looks like your cat is on top of your shoulder.
Oh, yeah.
I thought he came out of your ear.
Yeah, that.
That's pretty much what we're trying to do, isn't it?
Yes, that's it. Yeah. Very good. It's no point in me even adding anything to that. You've said it really, haven't you?
I think we do, and you see me do this a lot. I've always thrown things out by the bucket loads. Things that would take years maybe to sit down and just go through a couple of bits and pieces. But the reason we do this is because it's important. It's a pressure cooker situation. When you're in the kind of the live battlefield, the psychological battlefield of it. Trust me, you want out of it. You've been in there all your life, and you've seen enough, and now you see it kind of mature.
Well, we also know that there was a side to it. I mean, as you said, it's not just a wander down the lanes of history, if you know what I mean, that people get to do sometimes. It's not like that because there's an emergency in the sense that for a lot of people, and travellers, obviously for travellers, in particular for travellers, against the wall, the pressure has been unrelenting for centuries, essentially. But for particularly, as you would say, since the 60s, and that's a problem. That's something that we couldn't in conscience stand around and watch that without doing or saying something if it would help in any way at all. To be practical, give people some relief or space, and as you said, then it covers things that it might sound strange thinking that mental health would have something to do with history, but it can do, because at the end of the day, in colonized countries, when they're split, when people are cut off from their past, not that they don't have, they have all the cultures with them. But when they're cut off from that bigger picture, if you know what I mean, and other people,
I know. I'm even the mental health aspect that I went through. For the best 20 years, struggling to trying to find out this kind of conflict. And it's one of those things you can't point to, you can't say it because you don't have the words. You can't explain it because it's not fully thought out in your head. But you know it's there, and you're almost powerless in an environment. And it's only when you start to pick up bits and pieces. And again, my lived experience. Segregation, travel-only buses, travel-only signing on times, travel-only times and go to a particular time to see the doctor, even if it's an emergency. These are things that happened in my lifetime. These are things that happened to younger travellers than me. Things that happened in the 1960s and even a couple hundred years ago to Native Americans, institutionalizing them. That happened decades ago to Irish travellers, where 48 travellers went into one home, 46 died, 2 survived some years later. And a lot of abuse went on there, equal par with some of the worst, disgusting stuff that has been happening. So we're all connected, we're all human. I do truly believe that we're going to take a huge step outside this crippling mentality and understand this from a completely different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Foley, thank you very much for your time, my friend. This is for Mayo Says No to Racism, but it's quite obvious we're going to smash racism pretty bad, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.